The way that we look at how to apply robotics and AI has really got to change. The biggest by far employment of unmanned ground vehicles was in 1943. That was the Battle of Kursk. The systems that ultimately revolutionized warfare in the age of industrialization, they were not horseless versions of anything that existed before. What are the transformational systems that are going to dominate combat in the 21st century? They are not going to be unmanned things that we are familiar with.
George, thanks for joining me today.
Dan, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I have to admit I'm having a little bit of a fanboy moment right now. I loved your book, and we're going to talk a lot about it today. Beast in the Machine. Someone very high up at the U.S. Navy actually recommended I read it, so I think your fanboy club goes dramatically further than this room.
Well, thanks. Well, one of the other things that just happened is we're just getting ready to release the Korean language translation. That's about to come out. But, I think one of the nicest pieces of feedback I got was the fact that Ukrainians are actually the first in line to say we have to make a foreign language edition of this and release it in Ukraine. So, as you know, they know a thing or two about autonomous warfare. So that was quite a nice thing to hear.
Yeah, when the experts want to read your book, that's a pretty good kudos, right? Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So yeah, I've got kind of an interesting background. I would say I've got sort of a three-sided background that I bring to this that kind of led to the creation of the book, actually. Mm-hmm. So I'm a scientist by training, or an engineer. So I've got my PhD in material science and engineering from Berkeley. Mm-hmm. So I started out in research, but then I also have a parallel military career. So I spent 30 plus years in Air Force, in acquisition, research, and development, starting with the F-22 fighter plane all the way through to the present. And so I co-authored the Air Force's Science and Technology Strategy. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason I did that, I was called in for my parallel career, which is the third leg of this sort of three-sided stool, which was I've had a career as a management consultant in 2 international strategy and operations consulting companies, mm-hmm. mostly consulting to high-tech and life sciences companies on how to handle strategic change and conduct transformation, which is an analogous challenge, maybe smaller and more finite, to what the entire defense enterprise is seeing today. So back in 2018 or so, they approached me and said, hey, we're getting ready to try to do a complete revamp of the Air Force's strategy for how we deploy all of our science and technology resources to get after the future. Can you help us write that? So I did that for a year or two. Mm-hmm. Came out with the S&T 2030 strategy, mm-hmm. which is still very much in effect, mm-hmm. but it was very transformational, made some major changes, such as launching the Air Force's Vanguard programs like Skyborg. Mm-hmm. And so those are examples of those that came out of that. Mm-hmm. And then after that, they asked me to stick around for a couple more years and co-lead the implementation across the enterprise. So as a result of being there on the inside, I was able to see over the course of a few years how the discussions were evolving around things like the future of AI and robotics in warfare, particularly in the air domain, but also in other places. Because I also was at the OSD, Office of Emerging Capability and Prototyping. I was the senior military leader there. Mm-hmm. But I was consistently unimpressed with the level of deep thinking that was going on. And that's not a specific knock on this area. One of the other books that I really like and I recommend to people is a book by Dima Adamski called The Culture of Military Innovation. He's Israeli, but he talked about how the U.S., Russian, and Israeli military cultures are so different. And one of the things that he certainly lauds the U.S. for a lot of incredible technology and tactical prowess and so forth. But one of the things that we are not great at is sort of that deeper, longer-term thinking. Yeah. And so trying to fill in some of that was really what led me to write this book. Try to get after this in some of the similar ways that authors like Billy Mitchell and others, JFC Fuller, mm-hmm. folks like that, tried to do during the interwar period when we were facing another period of really technologically driven change, and everyone was scratching their heads about what does this mean for the future of warfare. Obviously, the old ways are obsolete, but what comes next?
When you were in the seat, would you get frustrated with this kind of lack of critical thinking, or would you try and basically encourage people to, I don't know, you can't really, develop or deploy some of these skills?
Yeah, it's in some ways, coming from that management consulting background, that we have a saying that organizations or businesses don't rise to the level of their intentions, they fall to the level of their processes. And so what I was always, the lens that I always looked at this through is how can we fix the process to make it structurally encouraging for that kind of deep thinking to occur, right? Because we used to be really good at that, and it's only been fairly recently that the Department of Defense, the U.S. military, has become less adept, let's say, at technological transformation. We were probably the world leaders, not just in the public sector, but including in the business world, for how to do transformation for decades, right? Probably from, the turn of the last century all the way up through the Cold War.
Yeah.
And a lot of those military advanced R&D and transformation things actually informed the way that businesses in the middle of the 20th century got after innovation. Mm-hmm. And now it's just flipped a little bit. I think there's been this incredibly long period of stasis that we think of as the status quo, but is actually very strange for the military. The fact that we have a lot of systems today that you and I are familiar with, the big five on the military, on the Army side, right? The Abrams tank, the Bradley, the Patriot. Mm-hmm. On the Air Force, the F-15, the F-16, and so forth. Those are all systems that fought in the Gulf War in 1991, and they're still frontline systems today. There has not been a period in American military history where we've had the same systems in frontline service for, 30 plus years. This is actually a pretty recent phenomenon.
How much of that is a result of who we were fighting during GWOT over the last 20 years?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. At the end of the Cold War really took the pressure off the need to innovate because we lost a pacing threat, let's say. During the days of the Soviet Union, everyone was constantly sweating the latest, revelation.
Yeah, invention.
Magic
weapon.
The MiG-25 was going to make all of our aircraft obsolete, and so on. But that didn't happen anymore after the end of the Cold War. We were fighting adversaries that, not to say they should be overlooked because they turned out to actually be very tough in their own way, but they weren't technological rivals. Yeah. That's another thing we talk about in the book too, is that, just because you have superior technology does not mean you're going to win the war. We had technological superiority in Afghanistan, in Iraq. In fact, unquestioned technological superiority, probably by, an order of magnitude. And yet that did not necessarily lead to strategic victory. So one of the other things that's important is, war continues to be politics by other means, and that we have to insert that understanding into how we develop and deploy autonomous systems, robotics, and AI, because you're still fighting a war, not a robot soccer tournament or a game of Go. Yeah. So those timeless things are still going to have to be factored in.
Pull on that thread some more. I mean, again, you use war as a tool to achieve an end, right? Yeah. And so, how do you think autonomous systems and AI are going to factor into that? I mean, today and then moving forward.
Yeah. So, some of the things we talk about in the sweep of history, which we might get to in a little bit,
in a minute. Yeah.
is how robotics and AI have been developed and deployed over time. And a lot of what we're doing today is still very much in the mode of three classical concepts that actually were first demoed more than a century ago. We think these things are cutting edge. The tech gets better, but the concept is very, very old. Right. So the first of those is the aerial torpedo, which was prototyped for the first time by Lawrence Sperry in 1916. Right. And that's basically a little aircraft with an explosive payload on it and a guidance system. Shawhead, and most of our cruise missiles and things, exactly the same thing, just with better tech. If they had NVIDIA boards and things like this back then, they probably would have made exactly what we had today, but they did the best that they could. The others are the Tele-Automaton, which is actually the remote-controlled drone, whether it's a UXS or of any domain. That was something that Nikola Tesla first demonstrated, and he opined quite a bit about how it was going to transform future warfare. Future wars would be fought without men in direct contact with each other. They would be using these basically teleoperated systems. It's very reminiscent of what we're doing today. Of course, the tech was also extremely primitive, and he didn't get the Navy, for instance, of his day to buy any of his systems because I think they were shrewd enough to say, that is not ready for fielding. But his ideas were way ahead of their time.
Yeah.
And then the third one, the autonomous homing weapon, basically a heat-seeking missile or an anything else-seeking missile. That was first demonstrated in the form of a little prototype ground vehicle that would track and home in on light sources in 1912. So John Hayes Hammond Jr. and one of his colleagues developed that. They actually had a big patent fight over it. But that, again, is almost exactly the same mechanism that's in the Seeker for a laser-guided bomb. Mm-hmm. So, those are really old things, right?
Yep.
And so, the way that we look at how to apply robotics and AI has really got to change. It's got to evolve, right? Just continuing to pull the thread on those old standard, very time-worn systems and concepts is not going to get us to superiority in the next phase. Yeah. So one of the things we talk about quite a bit is what I call sort of the shock of the new, or the coming Cambrian explosion of new concepts. And I think one of the great takeaways, and one of the things that makes me cringe every time I hear somebody say it, right, is unmanned something. Yeah. Like an unmanned tank, unmanned ship, unmanned aircraft. We used to use the term horseless in almost exactly the same way back when we were in the previous major military transformation of the early 20th century, when we were mechanizing and industrializing. People would talk about a horseless carriage, right, or a horseless tiller, which was a tractor. Yep. And it seemed at the time that was really futuristic, because if you saw a carriage trundling along with no horse attached, that would blow your mind. But in reality, it was just an adaptation, a pretty straightforward modification of something that was already familiar. But if you look at the systems that ultimately revolutionized warfare in the age of mechanization, industrialization, they were not horseless versions of anything that existed before, right? The mechanization of ground combat was not a mechanical horse. And similarly, if we look forward to what are the transformational systems that are going to dominate combat in the 21st century, they are not going to be unmanned things that we are familiar with. If we get to the point where I can't describe that as an unmanned X, it's just its own thing that doesn't have a name yet, then we know we're getting there.
Do you think that taking that approach would fundamentally change how folks actually view these systems in a sense of like the value? Like, do we attach value to like an unmanned thing in my brain based on like how we've seen warfare for the last 100 years? Well, it doesn't have a fighter pilot in it, so maybe it's not as good. Do you know what I mean?
Yep. We definitely need new measures of effectiveness. That's one of the definitions, in fact, of a disruptive innovation or disruptive transformation. Yeah. That the metrics that you use actually change. One of the things we talk about is in the book also is the dynamics of disruptive innovation, which comes from business consulting and so forth as well. Yep. And some of the metrics that used to be the things that determined what a good computer was back in, say, the mainframe computer age, turned out to be pretty obsolete when computers started to look like things that you put on your desktop and that you could buy at Radio Shack or the Apple Store, as opposed to something that you had to contract with a major defense prime or a big company like Digital Equipment Corporation or IBM for millions of dollars to install.
It's the size of a house.
Exactly, exactly. And they didn't measure them in the same way. For instance, price was really not much of an object back then. But, after that, whether something was $400 or $500 made a big difference in the marketplace.
Totally.
But, a lot of the other metrics, it's the same thing with transformation of consumer things that a lot of us are familiar with, like video streaming, which took over the market from video rental stores, right? How many days you were allowed to keep your video for, things like that became completely irrelevant.
Yep.
How much your membership card cost or whatever. All these things that the folks in that industry used to obsess about turned out to be irrelevant after the disruption took hold.
Yeah.
But I think cross-pollinating some of those lessons from the commercial world and the study of disruptive innovations in commercial industry and getting those back into the government where they've never lived, or at least not, since the end of the Cold War, is really important right now.
Yeah. We'll pick that thread back up in a second. I do want to go back now because you do an incredible job of walking through at different times in history how these systems have been used and deployed. So you gave us the starting block. We'll call it right around pre-World War I, World War I. Talk to us about the history of these kind of coming up until present day. There's a couple key buckets here.
Well, just a few things that blow everyone's mind.
Yeah.
Because somehow we have forgotten some of the most important things that should just be universal knowledge to everyone, especially anyone working in this field, right? The biggest by far employment of unmanned ground vehicles for large-scale ground combat was in 1943. That was the Battle of Kursk. Mm-hmm. The largest tank battle in history was actually spearheaded by unmanned ground vehicles, armed unmanned ground vehicles being used in a manned-unmanned teaming arrangement. How many people know that, right?
I'd never heard that until I'd read that. It was incredible.
Yeah. And so we don't know about it because it happened on the Eastern Front. So it turns out that those unmanned ground vehicles, which were technically, the Borgvard B4 remote-controlled assault vehicles, they were deployed ahead of the Tiger tanks and other heavy assault units that were the leading spearheads of the German attack into the Soviet lines. Their job was to roam ahead of those leading elements as a reconnaissance screening force, but also as a mobile demolition capability to destroy hard points, anti-tank guns, fortifications, things like that. And so the tech was, once again, pretty primitive. It was basically the same as you would find in a remote-controlled toy car today. But of course, at the time, it blew everybody's minds, the idea that you would have an unmanned vehicle roaming around, dropping explosive charges, and doing all of that.
How many did they deploy?
So there were 3 companies of remote-controlled tank units. There were 3 remote-controlled Panzer companies that were deployed at the Battle of Kursk. And so each one had probably a dozen control tanks, which at that time were Panzer IIIs, mm-hmm. and each of the Panzer IIIs controlled 2 unmanned ground vehicles at a time on 2 different frequencies. Mm-hmm. So if one was destroyed, they would just flip frequency to the other one. Mm-hmm. And then they always had 2 in backup. Mm-hmm. So not too dissimilar to a concept you might find today with UGVs.
Sure.
And some of the unmanned teaming concepts were actually pretty similar. So once again, this goes back to the stuff we learned long, long ago and are relearning now. So for instance, they figured out pretty quickly that the deploying the unmanned ground vehicles in front was really helpful to the manned spearheads that were following behind. But also the control tanks needed to use their machine guns or their main guns to provide covering fire for the robots, because otherwise they would be picked off by anti-tank guns and so forth. But so it was a teaming effort. Each one complemented the abilities of the other. Another great example that is amazing is the assault drone units that the U.S. Navy fielded in the Pacific War in World War II. Another thing that most of us never get introduced to. So it's amazing to think that we fielded an entire, basically a tactical group of assault drones and drone control aircraft that were conducting offensive operations against Japanese bases in the Pacific in 1944. Mm-hmm. By far the first example of using unmanned aircraft in suppression and destruction of enemy air defenses was at Rabaul in 1944. And it was not small. It was, there were probably 70 large fixed wing first person view UAS. About 50 of them were expended in combat. And unfortunately, at the end of the war, we didn't really need them anymore because we had such dominance at that point over the Japanese that this what had started out as a asymmetric solution to a really dangerous threat after Pearl Harbor turned out to be something extra that we really didn't need anymore. So after they were used in combat for a while, because they were highly secret and the U.S. didn't want them to be discovered, all of the surviving drones and their Avenger drone control planes were bulldozed into the Pacific Ocean, and they remained secret for decades after that. So all of the lessons that we had learned back then were kind of forgotten as a result.
Right. And then you touch on like some of the stuff I was familiar with, the use of unmanned aerial vehicles in Vietnam. And I know I just used the phrase you hate. But basically how we had some hard points or some targets we kept losing people trying to take out. And I think it's interesting because it's almost like when I learned about the assault airplanes from World War II, I was like, these guys, you figured this out, 25 years before. Like if we'd had some lessons learned here, we could have deployed this and probably saved a lot of American service members too, quicker. You know what I mean? In Vietnam.
Yeah, it's a shame to see us keep learning the same lessons over and over again.
Yeah.
Right. And fighting some of the same battles internally.
Yeah.
Because, it wasn't just the technical lessons or the tactical lessons that was learned. It was also, there was a lot of change management and change thinking that had to happen. And getting over that hump to where there was some acceptance of these things is a big part of the battle, as you know, working in the emerging defense tech industry. And to have that boulder kind of roll back to the bottom of the hill again and everyone forget that, we already did learn that this is important. We can just start where we left off. Would have been great. At the end of that war, the question was, okay, what do we do with these now? Because they were used for specific needs. Yeah. And then, who was going to maintain them? Who was going to be the community to maintain the expertise in them? And so they moved around from different command to different command and eventually got just shut down because there wasn't an urgent need at that time. But some of the things that they were doing with them after the war ended were still incredible. They were actually deployed to Top Gun, the Navy's fighter weapons school. Yep. And were used as aggressors for a while, unmanned aggressors, because their capabilities tactically were so amazing. They could easily outmaneuver the F-4s that were being used otherwise as aggressors at the time. There were some great examples of some amazing tactical maneuvers they would do. And for a while, it was almost obvious to everyone that unmanned fighter aircraft were going to be the future of air combat. That didn't turn out to happen right away. Once again, because the tech was a little bit too primitive. Sure. But now we're back to that point again.
Universal precision.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how one of the overarching themes of the book is how the U.S. kind of gained it and now how it's being democratized, for lack of a better word. We tell us that story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, precision arose in its modern sense during the Vietnam War with the first laser-guided bombs, right? And that was entirely a U.S. innovation, and it was meant to help us get after the threat of those massive Soviet tank divisions that were going to roll into Western Germany and overwhelm NATO. Mm-hmm. It was an offset strategy, but the ability to do with one bomb what would normally have taken dozens or hundreds really multiplied the lethality of the U.S. forces by the same factor. So it allowed a small, U.S. squadron or, missile firing ground unit to be able to take on enemy units of, dozens or even more times their size. That was our ace in the hole, and the thing that kept us in a state of technological supremacy. Happily, it turned out we never needed to use those in a massive war against the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But after the end of the Cold War, Saddam Hussein, in all of his infinite wisdom, decided that would be the moment to invade Kuwait.
Yeah.
And so all that kit that we had previously developed to use against the Soviet armies, we just popped open a can of that on him in the Gulf War. And it was a tremendous walkover, of course, as we all know. The casualties on the U.S. side were so low that you would expect similar casualty numbers if we had had that many people participating in a live fire training exercise. So, but that was a period when we were the only ones who could execute that kind of precision strike campaign. Today, with the rise of very low cost, very producible precision weapons, almost anyone, any significant military force in the world can do that. The first really major war, let's say, between states that was fought with robotic weapons was the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War. The important thing about that is not what happened. It was actually a lot like Desert Storm in a way, except that it was conducted not by a leading global superpower with, hundreds of billions of dollars in defense spending like the United States. It was conducted by Azerbaijan, a small country that was ranked 60th in the world for military spending. Yet they were able to conduct an incredible precision robotic strike campaign, combined with a doctrine that actually capitalized on those abilities. They had supporting, commando units and maneuver units that were actually set up to exploit the things that their robotic weapons were able to do on the battlefield. It was a complete walkover. It was such a devastating and surprising defeat for the Armenians that they had protesters storm the National Assembly.
Yeah,
the government almost collapsed.
Yeah,
no one could believe that they could have. They actually won the previous war, but it took 6 years. That they could have lost everything in 44 days. They were shocked at how could they have been caught sleeping so much, right? How could the government have done such a bad job to allow this to happen? So that's one of the things I do worry about a lot today, is that because this great leveling of capability and lethality that comes from universal precision, which is no longer our monopoly, that we are now exposed to the risk of having something happen to us like happened to the Armenians. In many ways, going back to that PC analogy, the U.S. military and the defense industrial complex are the mainframe manufacturers like Digital Equipment Corporation and IBM. They are no longer, we are no longer in the position of dominance. We're in the position of being the disrupted. And if we don't get ahead of that very quickly, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where things that we used to visit upon other countries at our will could be visited upon us, and potentially by adversaries that we had never considered as being major threats to us before. Last thing I'll say about that is look at what happened with the Houthis, right? A few years ago, why would they even be anything more than a footnote to the United States military? Yet last year and the year before, the U.S. Navy mentioned that it had fought what it considered the most intense naval battles since World War II with the Houthis in the Red Sea, basically because they had acquired precision weapons that maybe weren't as good as those that the U.S. Navy had, but were good enough. They were definitely good enough to be a threat, and were able to really push the U.S. naval forces that were there into at least a stiff fight. How many forces around the world could be equivalent to the Houthis, right? If we are faced with a proliferation of that kind of capability now, where it's not just China and Russia that we have to worry about, but all these different cat and dog threats, it's going to be a very different world.
I totally agree. I mean, there's so many things we can talk about here. One of the things that I don't think people give enough credit to is the 15 or 20 Ukrainians that went to Syria and used what is just basic FPV tactics from that conflict in Ukraine with Russia against Assad, and they wiped out all of his armor, all of his outposts in a matter of days, right? And again, Assad spent a lot of money on defense. He had he had a lot of the cutting edge Russian stuff because this was a strategic foothold for Russia in the Mediterranean. So it's not like he was caught with his pants down. Where he was caught with his pants down was that, again, ultra low cost technologies that give smaller groups of folks the ability to deliver precision strike against bigger, better equipped, better armored adversaries. We actually get to see the effect of that. You know what I mean? And then the other one that is just super interesting to watch is the unbelievable acquisition and deployment of drones and counter drone systems by the cartels. Yep. It is incredible, and our media doesn't really talk about it. I have a bunch of friends in Mexico who send me stuff that is quite unbelievable. The cartels are fighting each other. Yep. They're fighting the state. But basically, when you have unlimited money like they do, the pace of innovation is just is mind-boggling. So these are two other events or things we can point to show that this is being adopted. My concern is when the war in Ukraine stops and you have the tier 1 guys who know how to do this, where are they going to go? What are they going to do? Are they going to work for non-state actors? Are they going to go teach an African dictatorship how to, employ drones to maintain control and terrorize whoever? I mean, that's where when the genie gets out of the bottle, I get incredibly concerned. And don't get me wrong, I think the genie's already out of the bottle.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think you're right.
Yeah.
One of the things that the Beast in the Machine talks about is the likelihood that there are going to be companies that see a business opportunity in helping various forces around the world employ precision strike, drone warfare, and so on. And that's actually happened within the past few weeks. In Haiti, there is a private military company that's actually been conducting drone strikes on behalf of Haitian security forces in their sort of internal struggle that's happening there, many of which have not been, let's say, up to the standards that we would want to see in terms of ethics and discrimination.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is already starting to happen. Exactly right. And there's still this sense of complacency, or at least there has been until really recently among the U.S. military.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, I'll hold that thought then.
No, keep going. I mean, I think that it's a super important part. I mean, there's this idea that what happened in Ukraine wasn't applicable elsewhere. I hear it all the time in the Pentagon. Yeah.
Look into history again. I call this Maxim's warning in the book. It's not as prevalent. It's not as big of a problem as it was before the Ukraine war broke out, which no one wanted to talk about drones or universal precision or any of those kinds of things. It just seemed so futuristic.
Yeah.
But the idea is that before World War I, the British had machine guns, Maxim guns, that allowed them to dominate colonial conflicts and so forth. And their adversaries in Africa, India, and so forth learned that they could not use the same tactics that they had used before because they were just going to get cut to ribbons. The funny thing was, the British Army never really considered what would happen when their adversaries had machine guns. They're like, no, we have machine guns.
Yeah.
We don't have to do anything. It turned out when they marched into those first battles in World War I, they effectively realized, everybody has machine guns.
Yeah.
And they got cut to ribbons because they had not adapted. And I know, Dan, because we were talking about this before, you still get a lot of this pushback from the U.S. Military services that, we're different. We're not Ukraine. We're not Russia. They don't have things that we have, like our combined arms maneuver capabilities, the ability to combine, artillery and ISR and infantry plus armor movement and all these things. If they were really going to ever fight a NATO unit, they would really find out that we actually have capabilities that they are not ready for. Well, that actually happened.
I know. And how did it go?
So there was a Ukrainian unit that went to an exercise in Eastern Europe, and there was a full-up British armored brigade there that was also participating. They ended up being pitted against each other in an exercise. Ukraine with its relatively light forces, but lots of FPV drones and so forth.
Yeah.
Long story short, the British armored brigade just got its butt handed to it. They were almost wiped out within a couple of days.
Yeah, they wiped them off the map in 2 days. It was incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was eye-opening because
Yeah.
there had been this complacency. Ukraine is a kind of a minor league military, and if they were to go up against the big boys,
Yeah.
they would learn who's boss.
Yep.
I think we learned that that's no longer a tenable position.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about another theme you have. You call it first, second, and third wave robotics kind of transformations. Can you walk us through how you see those and how you talk about them in the book?
Yeah. So I think this is really powerful because it also includes a little bit of the learnings of history, because almost exactly the same fundamental dynamic happened back in the World War I era. Like I mentioned before, that was a period when there was a great leap in lethality due to mechanization and industrialization. Back then, the big transformative weapon that appeared on the battlefield wasn't the small drone, it was the machine gun, and also the heavy indirect fire artillery system. And what happened then in that, let's say that first wave, was that incredible increase in the lethality of fires vastly overmatched the maneuver units of the day, which were mounted cavalry and pretty dense formations of infantry that marched in close ranks, and they didn't survive against that kind of fires. They were mobility was completely shut down, maneuver was suppressed, and what you got was static trench warfare and a battle of attrition that lasted for years. And the response of the militaries at that time was, we can't win through maneuver and the beautiful tactical feint and all those things that we had loved. It's going to be all about scale. Just there was the race to the sea. The more men we could put into the field, we could outflank the enemy. Ended up with trenches built from the Mediterranean all the way to the North Sea.
Yeah,
that didn't cause victory. It's like we've got to produce more artillery than the enemy, more machine guns. All it did was produce this snowballing spiral of disaster for all sides. That was basically the first wave. And we're seeing that, I believe, today. The first wave of this robotic revolution is the transformation of fires to achieve, through precision, a similarly great leap in lethality. So when you've got a weapon like an FPV drone that can do with a single strike what used to take hundreds, even thousands of rounds of ammunition, you have a similarly tremendous leap in lethality. And it's having the same effect. In fact, the trench lines in Ukraine are so reminiscent of some of the trench lines on the Western Front in World War I that people sometimes put pictures of them side by side and saying, "Wow, the past is future again."
Yeah,
but it's because of the same fundamental dynamic that the lethality of fires has dominated the maneuver platforms of the day. And that's the first wave of the robotic military revolution, which we're seeing today. And so, companies like Firestorm and others are really in the middle of helping us to get after that first wave of transformation, because we've got to have a lot more mass, we've got to have a lot more agility to be able to put those kinds of lethal systems into the field and avoid a window of vulnerability like we saw between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But that is not going to get us to dominance in the future, right? We do not want to get into a war of attrition, World War I style, with countries like China and Russia. That's not the kind of war the U.S. has ever tried to fight. Even back in the 20th century, coming out of World War I, we said, hey, no way we're ever going to fight a war like that. We are going to make sure that we have an advantage. And that's why we developed things like strategic air power and so forth, things that the enemy would have no answer to.
Yep.
The second wave is going to come when we pivot to that same type of thinking again, where we say scale and mass, That's the first reaction, and we have to do that because none of the militaries wanted to lose World War I. But when they came out of that, the smart ones said, we don't want to get into that kind of a fight again. The Germans, for instance, said, hey, we're going to develop a radically new ground maneuver concept built around tanks that are quite a bit different than the ones in World War I, yep. Ones that really capitalize on the fundamental advantages that are offered by mechanization and industrialization. What can they do if we really take it to the nth degree and build our whole tactical system around that? And that's where the armored blitzkrieg came from. Similarly, the U.S. and Britain said, we're going to avoid fighting ground wars of attrition because we're going to use strategic air power, just go over the top and bomb the enemy centers of gravity and win the war that way. So the countries that took that next step and said, how do we reinvent our maneuver platforms and our warfighting methods for the age of mechanization, which was the age of the future at that time, ended up doing really well in World War II. Germany crushed it in the beginning, and then the U.S. and Britain ended up dominating once air power really scaled up and came into the fray later. Countries that didn't, that said, no, we're going to stick with effectively the first wave, like France, thought they were being smart, in fact, just got surprised and defeated. So I think that's the key to getting back to a position of predominance where we're not just slugging it out in a fair fight, in a contest of mass and scale, but actually have that kind of dominant capability that we had, say, back in the Gulf War period, that we want to get back to again. We've got to get ahead of the next wave, and that's where we have the opportunity to really recapture enduring advantage.
And what is the next wave?
So the radical reinvention of maneuver platforms. So today we are still in a very similar situation to that World War I type situation, where we have basically fires from the future, all of the things that you're seeing in Ukraine and so forth, even though their current implementations are not that sophisticated. They're cheap, effectively hobby drones that are armed and used as weapons. We'll see those evolve over time, but the basic, even those relatively simple implementations, are still able to wipe out and suppress maneuver by armored formations like the Russian battalion, armored battalion tactical groups, and basically make it impossible to do anything other than small, detached unit infiltration tactics, like same thing that happened in World War I. But we have to move away from thinking about ground maneuver, especially in terms of unmanned tanks or any kind of armored vehicle, things that no longer really are viable in the age of weapon target asymmetry, when really small precision weapons can destroy large, expensive targets. We have to develop completely new maneuver platforms and dominate a new regime, such as the atmospheric littoral. And when we pivot to saying, well, we're not just going to try to protect and defend our maneuver formations, but we're going to rethink our maneuver formations, that's when we get into the second wave.
So you've done an incredible job of weaving history and technology together to kind of tell the story for how we've had these starts and stops. And then obviously with the current conflict in Ukraine, it's almost like, I wouldn't call it the inevitability, I'd call it the necessity of the Ukrainians who are outgunned, and outmanned 5-1, but also have an incredible tradition in the engineering and hard sciences. I think those two things kind of have combined to allow them to deploy a lot of this stuff quickly and en masse. Just yesterday we had, one of the guys who helped develop and build the Baba Yaga, so the bomber drones, in that chair, telling us about how, I had a IT business, but I'd also built my own drone in 2010 because I didn't want to climb on my roof, and I wanted to make sure that I had the branches off. I mean, it was fascinating. And so you had those type of folks who were forced into service to defend their country start bringing some of their technology expertise, how to build software packages, how to build hardware packages, and in create like what we see now with these modern drone wars. So I'm framing here's the big buildup. What are we missing now in the U.S.? Like, you're king for a day, you get to wave your magic wand. Mm-hmm. How do we catch up? And I think that is one of the big themes of your book. Like, we need to catch up.
Yeah, we do. So that story of how the kind of the scrappy innovators in Ukraine helped turn back the initial Russian invasion is such a fantastic story.
It's incredible.
Right. And there was this unit called Aerorozvika, which was basically a unit of volunteers from civilian life who were the ones who were experimenting with armed small drones for several years between the initial kickoff of the Donbass War and the war in 2022. And they were the ones who basically rose to the challenge of trying to turn back those big convoys of armored vehicles heading towards Kiev. They basically said, hey, I think we've got an answer for this. Yep. And they really shocked the Russians. When I think about this coming again from that strategy consultant, operations consultant mindset, once again I say, well, what do we do structurally that we can capture that fire in a bottle the same way that the Ukrainians did with Aerorozvika, but perhaps on a bigger scale? And it turns out that we have a forgotten but very effective way of doing that is gathered a lot of dust, but we really need to take it off the shelf again. If there was one thing I think that would have tremendous leverage at cracking this open, say cutting the Gordian knot of requirements and demand signal and the entire acquisition system, it would be for us to reinvigorate the concept of prototype units. Now, what is a prototype unit? There are a lot of units today that say, oh, we do prototyping. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the really time-tested practice that we used to have in the U.S. of fielding a first-of-its-kind unit that was itself a prototype of how we would fight with a new type of technology in the future. Mm-hmm. We used to charter those explicitly as, let's say, an experiment where we were going to charter a unit that used and was equipped with the latest, or let's say first generation of whatever the new and latest technology was, let's say armored vehicles. And they were given the task of find out what goodness is in an armored vehicle and what we really should be asking for, but also figure out the tactics, TTPs, ConOps, all those kinds of things, all the supporting things that you need, like logistics, training. What do we need to do differently in order to be effective at this new kind of warfare? And the thing that makes it so different from what we do today is that they were given usually a very short timeline to field a real combat capability. So a good example of this is the development of air mobile warfare in the pre-Vietnam period. There were helicopters that had become useful after World War II and after Korea, except they were just used for medevac and things like that. And there was a big question: could this really be used as a form of maneuver or assault unit? Could we make a helicopter-based fighting unit? Yeah. And we created the 11th Air Assault Division test. And that was equipped with early helicopters and basically given this task: figure out if this is possible. Yeah. If it is, what does the unit need to look like? Put in some reps and sets in exercises, actually fighting against other units to find out what works. After only 2 years as a prototype unit working on that problem, that 11th Air Assault Division test was rebadged as the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, and was the first full division sent into Vietnam to fight when the Vietnam War kicked off. Yeah. And they were the ones that were involved in that the famous Battle of Ya Drang, the one that was in the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, which was made into a movie. That was a prototype unit that had only been chartered 2 years before. And the last time we did that, and the book talks a little bit about some of the other prototype units that that were critical to making all of these major leaps of the 20th century, from carrier aviation to ICBMs. The last time we purposefully created a prototype unit was the 4450th Tactical Group, which was the secret Air Force unit that was established to figure out how to conduct operations with the F-117 Nighthawk stealth jet, which was highly, highly secret at that time. And they were stood up, I think it was in 1979. But they were given 40 months to field a frontline combat capability and have it ready for action. And that forced them to overcome all of these challenges that we think of as being the valley of death that prevents adoption. But because they had that prototype unit in place, they were able to overcome them very quickly, and actually were rebadged as the 37th Tactical Fighter Wing, used in Panama, and then deployed to huge effect in the Gulf War, and the rest is history. But one of the things that I think, since we're talking about defense tech and the emerging defense industry, one of the real benefits from that is also the interaction with the innovative defense industry of the time. Because as you know, there's a real, let's say, impedance mismatch between the speed and agility of defense startups and the giant scale of the defense acquisition world. Yeah. And, that's something that everyone in this industry is pretty familiar with. But one of the great advantages of the prototype units is because those prototype units were scaled similarly to the smaller defense startups that they were working hand in glove with, they made much, much better partners. They tended to have not just the similar scale and speed, they had their own organic acquisition, contracting shops, and so forth. So in those days, when you had some of these prototype units working with a company, you would literally in the morning find out that, hey, the results from yesterday's exercise have come in. We need a way to modify this to get after some new capability or to fix it. They could do the contract mod immediately, sign it, and sometimes by the next day, the company had the fix in place. And you could do that kind of thing with incredible speed. Yeah. The Firebee units in Vietnam did the same thing. The reason they were able to do so much is because they were innovating and iterating at an incredibly fast pace. That was because they had Ryan Aeronautical, which was a small company, which is now was bought by Northrop Grumman and became their drone fixed-wing UAV division. Back then, they were a small startup company, and they were forward deployed to, domestically to Tonopah Test Range out there near Area 51. Yep. They had their hangar there with their production facilities and engineers working side by side with the small prototype unit that was attempting to field those and get them ready to deploy to Vietnam, and were able to move so quickly that they really overcame all the aspects of that valley of death, and were able to get not just a cool demo, but an actual deployable capability ready to go into the theater within a shockingly short period of time. So we should be doing that again. I think that cuts the Gordian knot and gets over so many problems. And there's really nothing preventing us from doing it except just will. We could do it again today, and I really hope that we do.
Do you think that we're going to have an increased impetus to make some of these changes based on what we're seeing right now in the Middle East? The use and then also the defense of shaheeds. You know what I mean? I mean, could this end up being one of the moments? I'm asking you to be clairvoyant here. So I can ask you in 2 weeks. What do we actually see?
Yeah, well, I can only speak for myself and not for the Air Force or the DoD. Yeah. But I think that the current fight in the Middle East is similar in some ways to the fight in Ukraine, in that it's causing a lot of eyes to open, right? In this case, it's more about the long-range precision strike game as opposed to the close ground battle, but it's having a lot of the similar effects. And once again, it's things that were not unanticipated. I think, with the fight against the Houthis and others, the idea that magazine depth and the proliferation of potent capabilities by lower-tier adversaries because of the ability to scale relatively inexpensive but effective weapon systems was going to be a big problem. I think that's opening a lot of eyes again. But the thing that I do worry about is that that first reaction is basically to just skate after the puck, which is not how you win a hockey game.
Yeah.
Right. So right now, just like in World War I, if we might have said, oh, machine guns. It's all about machine guns. Buy as many machine guns as you can. That's what's going to win the war. Mm-hmm. That didn't turn out to be true. Right now, we're saying, small precision weapons that we can mass produce at scale, whether they're interceptors or strike weapons. That's what it's about. Make as many as you can. That's not wrong, but it's not the complete answer. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to get us out of that, I call it the attrition warfare trap, where if we just do that, and everybody just does that because that everybody else is doing it, mm-hmm. we're going to get into a situation which is, this recipe for not just static, futile, mutual destruction in attrition warfare, but it's also one that's ultimately going to be an unstable dynamic that's going to lead to an arms race that has no fixed endpoint, right? Because when you're talking about trying to have enough expendable weapons, whether they're defensive or offensive, how many is enough? Well, more than the other guy has. Yeah. Right. If you're going to say, how many interceptors do I need? You need enough you need more than the enemy has strike weapons. And how many strike weapons is enough? Well, it's enough to overcome all the enemy's interceptors plus enough to hit all the targets that you want to hit. And that means there's never a cap. You always have the incentive to try to make more. And that's not really a race we want to get in. Yeah. Because you have countries like Russia out there. Let's just talk about the traditional adversaries. They boast about their ability to outsuffer their enemies, right? That's a country that lost, more than 10 million people in World War II and use that as a point of pride. Yeah. Both them and China suffered massively. And they look at us as not being able to take as many hits as they can and keep on going. Because once we're in a fight for a little bit and oil prices start to go up, we start to worry about our ability to sustain the fight. Yep. They can say, well, the Russians, they've already taken 1.3 million casualties in Ukraine, and they're still going. Yeah. And they say, hey, bring it on. That's the kind of fight we want to have because we think we can defeat the U.S. if it comes to that kind of a fight. We don't want to be in that kind of a fight. And so that's what I worry about. If we only take the very, very near-term lessons from what's happening in Iran, we might get ourselves stuck in exactly the kind of dynamic that's not going to serve us well.
Last question. Okay. We obviously met over a book you created, right? What are you reading now? Like what's on your nightstand?
That's a good one because there's so much analysis coming out now with all the things that are happening immediately that I'm trying to absorb a lot of that, which hasn't been necessarily converted into a book yet. Yeah. But the one book that I actually just bought, I can tell you last weekend I was speaking up at an event and I got a chance to go to the American Heritage Museum outside of Boston, which is a private military museum. One of the great things about this museum is that they have the only example of a Borgward B4 in the United States. Really? So that was quite a treat for me.
You got to show me that picture.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. So of course I had to get a selfie with it and so on. Yeah. But I did buy a book there, which was about looking at the French preparations in advance of World War II. Sure. It's a little bit academic, but looking at what they were thinking when they did what they did with the Maginot Line and their what they called their methodical or scientific approach to warfare, which they thought, they had it down and knew exactly what was going to happen. How did they get it so wrong? I think that's really interesting to study. Not only, how did some forces get it right, but why did some forces get it wrong? And are we doing the same thing, right? Yeah. What were the arguments that they put in place? And I've only gotten part of the way through it, but a few of the times I've been a little aghast at seeing some of the arguments that, the things that the Germans are doing are interesting, but they're not comparable to the mature level of warfare that we've already established in France. Dismissive things like that.
Yeah, some hubris.
So sure. I think it's been interesting so far. Sometimes to see the same mistakes potentially being repeated, but I think and part of my mission is to make sure that we don't, right?
Yeah.
To get ahead and make sure that we make the right decisions and come out of this in a strong position instead of repeating the bad parts of history that we don't want to repeat again.
George, thanks for coming on. We loved your book, and we'll have a couple links here in the podcast for folks who want to buy it.
Hey, Dan, this is fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah, and thanks for everything you're doing with the podcast and all the great folks you've had on. I find them incredibly interesting, and I love to be a watcher and a fan of the show myself. So thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Drone Wars podcast. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe to catch all the latest insights for all things defense and geopolitics.